On Divine Frenzy, Marsilio Ficino to Peregrino Agli. Greetings. On November 29th, my father, Ficino the doctor, brought me to Figlini 2 letters from you, one in verse and the other in prose. Having read these, I heartily congratulate our age for producing a young man whose name and fame may render it illustrious. Indeed, my dearest Peregrino, when I consider your age and those things which come from you every day, I not only rejoice but much marvel at such gifts in a friend. I do not know which of the ancients whose memory we respect, not to mention men of our own time, achieved so much at your age. This I ascribe not just to study and technique, but much more to divine frenzy. Without this, say Democritus and Plato, no man has ever been great. The powerful emotion and burning desire which your writings express prove, as I have said, that you are inspired and inwardly possessed by that frenzy, and this power, which is manifested in external movements, the ancient philosophers maintained was the most potent proof that the divine force dwelt in our souls. But since I have mentioned this frenzy, I shall relate the opinion of our Plato about in a few words, with a brevity which a letter demands, so that you may easily understand what it is, how many kinds of it there are, and which God is responsible for each. I am sure that this description will not only please you, but also be one of the very greatest used by you. Plato considers, as Pythagoras, Empedocles, and Heraclitus maintained earlier, that our soul, before it descended into our bodies, dwelt in the abodes of heaven, where, as Socrates says in the Phaedrus, it was nourished and rejoiced in the contemplation of truth. Those philosophers I have just mentioned had learnt from Mercurius Trismegistus, the wisest of all Egyptians, that God is the supreme source of light, within whom shine the models of all things, which they call ideas. Thus, they believed, it followed that the soul, in steadfastly contemplating the eternal mind of God, also beholds with greater clarity the natures of all things. So, according to Plato, the soul saw justice itself, wisdom, harmony, and the marvellous beauty of the divine nature. And sometimes he calls all these natures ideas, sometimes divine essences, and sometimes first natures which exist in the eternal mind of God. The minds of men, while they are there, are well nourished with perfect knowledge. But souls are depressed into our bodies through thinking about and desiring earthly things. Then those who were previously fed on ambrosia and nectar, that is the perfect knowledge and bliss of God, in their descent are said to drink continuously of the river Lethe, that is forgetfulness of the divine. They do not fly back to heaven, whence they fell by weight of their earthly thoughts, until they began to contemplate once more those divine natures which they have forgotten. The divine philosopher considers we achieve this through 2 virtues, one relating to moral conduct and the other to contemplation. For he names with a common term justice and the other wisdom. For this reason, he says, souls fly back to heaven on 2 wings, meaning, as I understand it, these virtues. And likewise, Socrates teaches in Phaedo that we acquire these, the 2 parts of philosophy, namely, the active and contemplative. Hence, he says again in Phaedrus, that only the mind of a philosopher regains wings. On recovery of these wings, the soul is separated from the body by their power. Filled with God, it strives with all its might to reach the heavens, and thither it's drawn. Plato calls this drawing away and striving divine frenzy, and he divides it into four parts. He thinks that men never remember the divine unless they are stirred by its shadows or images, as they may be described, which are perceived by all the bodily senses. Paul and Dionysius, the wisest of Christian theologians, affirm the invisible things that are of God and understood from what he has made and what is to be seen here. But Plato says that the wisdom of men is the image of divine wisdom. He thinks that the harmony which we make with musical instruments and voices is the image of the divine harmony, and that the symmetry and comeliness that arise from the perfect union of the parts and its members are the body of the image of the divine beauty. Since wisdom is present in no man, or at any rate in very few, and cannot be perceived by bodily sense, it follows that images of divine wisdom are very rare amongst us, hidden from our senses and totally ignored. Because of this, Socrates says in Phaedrus that the image of wisdom may not be seen at all by the eyes, because if it were, it would deeply arouse that marvellous love of the divine wisdom of which it is an image. But we do indeed perceive the reflection of divine beauty with our eyes and mark the resonance of divine harmony with our ears. Thus, those bodily senses which Plato considers the most perceptive of all. Thus, when the soul has received through the physical senses those images which are within material objects, we remember what we knew before when we existed outside the prison of the body. The soul is fired by this memory, and shaking its wings, by degrees purges itself from contact with its body, and its filth becomes wholly possessed by the divine frenzy. From the two senses I have just mentioned, two kinds of frenzy are aroused: regaining the memory and true of the divine beauty and appearance of beauty that eyes perceive. We desire the former with a secret and unutterable ardor of the mind. This Plato calls divine love, which he defines as the desire to return again to the contemplation of the divine beauty, a desire arising from sight of its physical likeness. Moreover, it is necessary for him who is so moved not only to desire that supernal beauty, but also holy delight in its appearance, which is revealed to his eyes. For nature has so ordained that he who seeks anything should also delight in its image. But Plato holds in the mark of a dull mind and corrupt state if a man desires no more than the shadows of that beauty, nor looks for anything beyond the form his eyes can see. For he believes that such a man is afflicted with the kind of love that is for the companion of wantonness and lust. And he defines as irrational and heedless the love of the pleasure in the physical form, which is enjoyed by all the senses. Elsewhere, he describes this love as the ardent desire of the soul, which in way is dead in its own body, while alive in another. He then says that the soul of a lover leads its life into another body. This the Epicureans follow when they say that love is a union of small particles, which they call atoms, made to penetrate the person from whom images of beauty have been taken. Plato says that this kind of love is born of human sickness and is full of trouble and anxiety, and that it arises in those men whose mind is so covered over with darkness that it dwells on nothing exalted, nothing outstanding, nothing beyond the weak and transient image of this little body. It does not look up to the heavens, for it is in black prison, it is shuttered by night. But when those whose spirit is drawn away and freed from the clay of the body first seen form and grace in anyone, they rejoice, as at the reflection of the divine beauty, which they should honor and desire above all, as it is by burning desire for this beauty that they may be drawn to the heavens. This first attempt at flight Plato calls divine ecstasy and frenzy. I have already written enough about that frenzy which, I have said, arises through the eyes. But the soul receives the sweetest harmonies and the numbers through the ears, and by these echoes is reminded and aroused to the divine music which may be heard by the more subtle and penetrating sense of mind. According to the followers of Plato, divine music is twofold. One kind, they say, exists entirely in the eternal mind of God. The second is in their emotions and orders of the heavens, by which the heavenly spheres and their orbits make marvelous harmony. In both of these our soul took part before it was imprisoned in our body. But it uses the ears as messengers, as though they were chinks in this darkness. By the ears, as I have already said, the soul receives the echoes of that incomparable music, by which is led back to the deep and silent memory of the harmony which it previously enjoyed. The soul then kindles with desire to fly back to its rightful home, so it may rejoice with that true music again. It realizes that as long as it is enclosed in the dark abode of its body, can in no way reach that music. It therefore strives wholeheartedly to imitate it, because it cannot here enjoy its possession. Now, with men this imitation is twofold. Some imitate the celestial music by harmony of voice and the sounds of various instruments, by these superficial and vulgar musicians. But some, who imitate the divine and heavenly harmony with deeper and sounder judgment, render a sense of its inner reason and knowledge into verse, feet, and numbers. It is these who, inspired by the divine spirit, give forth the full voice of the most solemn and glorious song. Plato calls this solemn music and poetry the most effective imitation of celestial harmony. For the more superficial kind which I have just mentioned does no more than soothe with the sweetness of voice, but poetry does what is also proper to divine harmony. It expresses with fire the most profound and, as a poet would say, prophetic meaning in the numbers of voice and movement. Thus not only does it delight the ear, but it brings to the mind the finest nourishment, most like food of the gods, and so seems to come very close to God. In Plato's view, this poetic frenzy springs from the muses, but he considers both the man and his poetry worthless who approaches the doors of poetry without the call of the muses, in the hope that we will become a good poet by technique. He thinks that those poets who are possessed by divine inspiration and power often utter such supreme words that, when inspired by the muses, that afterwards, when the rapture has left them, they themselves scarcely understand what they too have uttered. And, as I believe, the divine Plato considers that the muses should be understood as divine songs. Thus they say melody and muse take their name from song. Hence, divine men are inspired by divine beings and song to imitate them by employing the modes and meters of poetry. When Plato deals with the motion of the spheres in the Republic, he says that one siren established within each orbit, meaning, as one Plotinus says, that by movement of the spheres song is offered to the gods. For siren rightly means in Greek singing in honor of God. And the ancient theologians maintained that the 9 muses were the musical songs of the 8 spheres, and in addition, the one great harmony arising from all the others. Therefore, poetry springs from divine frenzy, frenzy from the muses, and the muses from Jove. The followers of Plato repeatedly call the soul of the whole universe Jove, who inwardly nourishes heaven and earth, and the moving seas, the moon's shining orb, the stars, and the sun. Permeating every limb, he moves the whole mass and mingles with its vast substance. It is thus that the heavenly spheres are set in motion and governed by Jove, the spirit and mind of the whole universe, and that from him also arise the musical songs of these spheres, which are called the muses. As that illustrious Plotinus says, Jove is the origin of the muses. All things are full of Jove, and that spirit which is called Jove is everywhere. He enlivens and refills all things, and Alexander Milesius, the Pythagorean, says, touch the heavens as though they were a lyre. He creates this celestial harmony. The divine prophet Orpheus says, Jove is first, Jove is last, Jove is head, Jove is the center. The universe is born of Jove. Jove is the foundation of the earth and of the star-bearing heavens. Jove appears as man, yet he is the spotless bride. Jove is the breath and form of all things. Jove is the source of the ocean. Jove is the movement in the underlying fire. Jove is the sun and the moon. Jove, the king and prince of all. Hiding his light, he has shed it afresh from his blissful heart, manifesting his purpose. We may understand from this that all bodies are full of Jove. He contains and nourishes them, so that truly it is said that whatever you see and wherever you move is Jove. After these, the following kinds of divine frenzy, which Plato considers are twofold. One is centered in the mysteries, and the other, which he calls prophecy, concerns future events. The first, he says, is a powerful stirring of the soul, in perfecting what relates to the worship of the gods, religious observance, purification, and divine sacred ceremonies. But the tendencies of mind which falsely imitates that frenzy he calls superstition, he considers that the last kind of frenzy, in which he includes prophecy, to be nothing other than knowledge inspired by the divine spirit, which we properly call divination and prophecy. If the soul is fired in the act of the divination, he calls it frenzy. That is, when the mind, withdrawn from the body, is moved by a divine rapture. But if someone foresees future events by human ingenuity rather than by divine inspiration, he thinks that this should be named for foresight or inference. From all this is now clear that there are 4 kinds of divine frenzy: love, poetry, mysteries, and prophecy. That common and completely insane love is a false copy of divine love. Superficial music of poetry, superstition of the mysteries, and prediction of prophecy, according to Plato. Socrates attributes the kind of frenzy to Venus, second to the Muses, third to Dionysius, and the last to Apollo. I have chosen to describe at greater length the frenzy belonging to divine love and poetry for 2 reasons. First, because I know you are strongly moved by both of these, and second, that you will remember that what is written by you comes not from you, but from Jove, and the Muses, with whose spirit and divinity you are filled. For this reason, my Pellegrino, you will act justly and rightly if you acknowledge, as I believe you do already, that the author and cause of what is best and greatest is not you, nor indeed any other man, but immortal God. Farewell, and be sure that nothing is dearer to me than you are. 1st of December, 1457.